Billy Meier's two visions of our future.
Translation by Vivian Legg and Marian Ollinger.
Therefore, I begin with the results from the view based on my calculations which, with some things, amount to an approximately 34% probability, but with most, around 56%, which however could in some circumstances each climb, whereby however already now the danger with this percentage exists that these probability possibilities can occur. This percentage data already has as a result that the entire happening, if it really still increases and actually occurs and therefore becomes reality, will be so monstrous in the future that, for the normal human being, everything will be as good as incomprehensible and will not be surmountable. Then I will now state all that which I have calculated in terms of probability according to my two visions, whereby I will begin with that which will lastly occur, should my visions and probability calculations fulfill themselves. Only after that I will name diverse factors which will entirely bring themselves together to that end, which will be unavoidable if humanity does not quickly change to the better in order to introduce a worldwide stop to births and a birth control and also democratic citizen-based governments. There too, however, all unrighteous elements of the state, government, administration and politics must be removed from their offices and replaced by effective powers who are close to the people and are righteous, who carry out their offices in line with the citizenry and namely affect the business of government of every kind democratically and according to the pure will of the people. But what I have to say and have calculated using probability corresponds to a somewhat extensive case that I have already written up, because the whole thing would be too extensive to remember. Therefore, I can read everything here from the computer and now present the results of my visions and probability calculations, and namely the following.
1. The great misery and end of the overpopulation story will be that it will be recognized by the world elite that the maintenance of their might can only be guaranteed by the overpopulation being drastically reduced, whereby this reduction of the humanity in the future time threatens to be carried out in felonious wise by the mighty ones of the world, if the growth of the mass of the overpopulation is not ended in the foreseeable time, through a drastic worldwide stop to births, and if a world-encompassing birth control is not arranged, the mighty ones of the world, that is to say, the state authorities, the dominators of the peoples and mighty capitalists, which as such form the world's elite, who on the whole are also blinded by their strongly religious, sectarian belief, and also will be in the future, will be much more malicious and worse in the kind and wise of their actions than the war and humanity felonies which happened through the Nazi horror. This future world mighty elite will know no mercy and carry out a humanity elimination which could not be more horrible. And according to probability, various possibilities for that show, such as that the diverse traditional death-bringing rapidly spreading diseases are adapted and prepared with deadly new active substances. However, also that artificially created illnesses for the decimation of the humanity will be used. In the same way, the calculations indicate that infectiously working poisonous biological substances will be used and their deadly effects presented as new and unhealable rampantly spreading diseases, whereby these poisonous substances then penetrate into the entire organism via the airways and the mouth as well as via the skin and mucous membranes, wherethrough inevitably unstoppable mass deaths will come about. Also deliberately cause famines and wars, poisonings of the food and of the water will belong to the arsenal of the decimation of human beings to the point of a governable minimum, which will occur worldwide, therefore not only in individual murderous and dictatorially led countries. Also a thermonuclear war for the depopulation of the majority of the mass of the earth humanity must be taken into consideration in order to reduce it so much that it can again be governed. Consequently from that also a murder of peoples, that is to say, murder of humanity, can come about on a scale as has never before happened.
However,
According to my probability calculations, before all this happens, the following Alsartungen will come about.
2. Generally, there exist already today in the entire world extremely complicated changes, and they will broaden in the coming time,
And they will have state, political,
capitalist,
military, economic, and citizen-based consequences called forth
through the might behavior of the incapable ones who,
Through wrong decisions, mismanagement, might claims on other countries, suppression of freedom and of peace, give reason in many regards for uprisings and revolts in their own countries, and so forth.
3. The small and large countries in the whole world will equip themselves militaristically with the most modern weapons to a degree never known before, whereby instead of peace, freedom, and security, the entire thing will generally, increasingly become a danger of quarrels with neighboring countries and armed conflicts and wars.
4. Generally, in the entire world, increasingly serious attacks on the police organs from anarchistic groups of the population will occur and also claim human lives, along with the arising of the destruction of state property, which eventually might also lead to militaristic engagements against the corresponding groups when the security organs no longer have them under control.
5. Along with the USA and Russia, China now also raises itself into the position of world politics and now, since the Korean War, leaves the purely observing, passive and watching position, which until now was its traditional position, and changes into a self-confident, great, and world might, and to the again blossoming new Chinese nation with an impressively growing economy, whereby, on the world political stage, the Socialist People's Republic of China no longer makes a secret of its ambitions as leading might and great might and so forth, and in every regard will, to a great extent, militaristically heavily arm itself.
6. Everything concerning refugees will continue to increasingly climb in the future, where through finally on the earth 250 to 300 million human beings will leave their homelands as refugees and spread themselves throughout the world. Regarding this especially, Europe will bring forward the whole thing as a consequence of the mismanagement through the low intelligence of false humanitarian governors and groups of the population, where through new afflictions and illnesses are called forth and will spread confusion, whereby also the hostility towards foreigners will increase, as will the race hatred, religious hatred, and sect hatred, the criminality and the felony.
7. The coming times bring many technological developments, which will, however, evoke both benefit for the humanity as well as disadvantage and harm. Nature and its fauna and flora. That is to say, the entire ecosystem and the climate will be increasingly destroyed through the felonious machinations and outgoing effects of the overpopulation, which are getting very badly out of the control of the good human nature, and indeed, as a consequence of the rationality less approval given for it by the governments in regard to the environment-destroying machinations. So for that also, the state mighty ones, governors and politicians are responsible, often also the military, as well as the lobbyists, privately acting persons, populists and all other ones who take actions, who with their growing might and their filthy fingers reach into the governments and play their part in continuously destroying nature, its fauna and flora, and the climate. Altogether, additionally, broken down everywhere, will be the inhibition level which could still prevent much default, which comes forth in increasing form through Ausartungen, unconcernedness, hate, unpeace and envy, and so forth. as the malicious consequence out of the growing overpopulation, as also out of their machinations, evil fights over resources arise between the countries and will lead to war and armed conflicts. The rapidly increasing technical development as the phenomenon of the progressive time in the 21st century will be underestimated in its negativity, because it will bring great dangers with it, through which ultimately the future of the entire humanity, and thereby also that of the future generations, will be put at risk.
8 worldwide, again and again, new countries will fall into turmoil, because in them, citizen-based and separatist-formed rioting will arise, which will lead to serious domestic political and economic insurgencies, excesses, as well as to default and confusion.
9. As it has been since time immemorial, it will also be in the coming time that the God-believers fight, hate, and make enemies of each other, and indeed not only the believers of diverse religions, rather also of the sects, wherethrough also in this wise, again and again, belief-based quarrels and terrorism flame up, and malicious unpeace, hate, as well as wars, massacres, and forced displacements, suffering, affliction, and misery will come over the humanity. And that will happen and will repeat itself as long as religions and the sects which result from them exist. And also new ones will form.
10. The governors, the mighty ones of the state, and the politicians, of whom a great part already works in a populist form, whereby also lobbyists play a part, however, fall into increasingly diverse forms of populism, and come to might with populistic inciting, deceitful promises, and with lies. They lead the populations into confusion, and, through wrong leadership, into affliction, difficulties, and doubt, as well as into unregulated states that are destroying the right conditions and are state endangering, whereby in Europe, along with Switzerland, in which unfortunately also diverse populists and lobbyists can perform their mischief, to the detriment of the rights and freedom of the citizens. Also Germany, and naturally the EU dictatorship, as well as especially France, England and Holland, and also Austria, because of the populists and lobbyists in the governments and amongst politicians. The population has its rights curtailed, is disadvantaged, and exploited through new charges and taxes, and so forth, and will also be in the future.
11. The public media of all kinds also will increasingly become a populist factor of might, through whose machinations and sense the populations are influenced and steered in a media populist form, whereby through the media and its might, false information which serves them is spread and the population is led into delusion.
12. Populistically created and steered conspiracy theories and mendacious reporting will increasingly come about and will lead the populace of all countries into confusion and make them believers of all those who, by exploiting the people, attain horrendous profits from the whole of the conspiracy lies, and at the same time control the population.
13. The political risks increasingly dramatically climb,
as also in regard to the humanitarian matters,
the economic problems, the entire national economy and corporations, whereby also great dangers exist through wars and the international terrorism risk, and thereby also security risks play great roles.
14. Today's and the further coming world situation has become so dangerous that it is already in many a wise more dangerous than at the time when the Cold War still prevailed, and from now on will broaden out more.
15 in the absolute foreground of all coming evil. Negative and bad changes through interference in foreign countries' internal and external affairs. Happenings. Modes of action. Conflicts. Problems and so forth. Is the USA, with its pathological craving for world domination. Which, obsessed with might, as it has been since its beginning, increasingly interferes in the interests of other states and their domestic and foreign political affairs. Concerns and interests, and thereby provokes disturbance, unpeace, wars, and other armed engagements.
16 positive confederations,
connections,
agreements and contracts between diverse countries and organizations, and so forth, set up and having come about as a result of considerable effort, will partly or totally disband and fall apart, whereby often the USA will be the driving power for that, and therethrough, again and again, stir up new enmities between countries as well as great insecurity, disturbance, unpeace, revolutions, and the danger of war.
17. In the future, the USA and the US governors will be exposed to very frequent threats, which will come from both state and non-state acting persons, who are hostile towards the government and state, as well as from great parts of the US population, whereby the US population will split into different population groups, for which the basic factors have already been created, and consequently, the US population already in the current time separates into different groups.
18 again, and again there arise new hostilities between diverse countries, which lead to political and economic differences and to evil and destructive wars and armed engagements. As a result, a fourth world war constantly has to be taken into consideration again and again. In this regard, the USA's criminal and felonious world domination affectations and world police affectations, as well as its political machinations, are especially in the foreground as the driving power.
19 worldwide. Diverse countries get increasingly on the edge of a collapse. In regard to public policy, while an intensification of the bad security situations internally, just as externally, through extreme terroristic and military as well as dictatorial machinations, will climb.
20. In spite of other efforts of the government, Russia will be the target of terrorists, whereby especially Islamic attacks from the autonomous regions, Dagestan and Chechnya will threaten.
21. For the sake of their greed from might, and in order to maintain it, the nuclear weapon states will carry out wars with atomic weapons as well as with other weapons of mass destruction, and thereby spread affliction, death, misery, destruction, and elimination over the entire earth.
22. Natural resources will become such rare materials that the countries will trigger and wage wars about them, which get very badly out of control, whereby quite especially certain great mighty nuclear weapon states will apply their deadly weapons without scruples.
23. The prosperity of the entire humanity will be threatened, already in the current time, and more than ever in the future, through authoritarian tendencies of the elites of the governments, politicians, populists, and the capitalists, whereby inevitably also societal signs of decay will go hand in hand with it.
24. The Earth Hunkind will bring about the most unscrupulous and life-disdaining and human-disdaining systems of rule, as have never before appeared on the Earth, whereby the executors of the rule and regency, those greedy for possessions and the mighty capitalists, will steer the ship of humanity from one catastrophe to another.
25. The terrorism with both a religious sectarian political form as well as human hostile and state hostile form will increasingly take the upper hand worldwide. And the deadly and destructive terrorist attacks of all kinds will demand more human lives all over the world and will call forth destructions with a devolved nature. The entire worldwide terrorism will strike again and again and will become a nightmare for the Earth humanity.
26. The political risks increase worldwide and threaten to very badly get out of the control of the good human nature with regard to instability. All kinds of armed conflicts, as well as wars and acts of terror. Wherever through also in this regard, the terrorist danger, which has got very badly out of the control of the good human nature, will increase considerably and will drive the world to the edge of a collapse.
27 worldwide, the incessantly growing overpopulation and all the maladministration systems of all kinds and in all areas will continue to drive the numbers of unemployed high and achieve forms which will call for tremendous problems, as has never been the case with any earlier times of unemployment.
28. In the whole economy, wages for the employees will sink very low and call forth monstrous financial problems in all levels of the population of the workers' world, whereby also the whole social services will suffer harm, break down, and all around, also the rapidly increasing criminality will call forth tremendous problems.
39. Through speculators, a global financial and economic crisis will be called forth, such as has never before occurred. Consequently, also, the entire world of finance will get into great trouble, and also much terribleness, and great lack in regard to economic goods will come about.
30. Also, in the USA, the population shall get dispossessed as a consequence of the worldwide financial crisis, which will lead to the incensed and partly heavily armed population being advanced on by military and police powers with evil gewalt. Now,
31. The planned ban on cash shall bring about the dispossession of the populations, while, however, the elite of the governors and of capitalism can, for their part, swim in joy and splendor. And the entire financial system of the entire world shall be toppled, in order thereby to newly arrange all existing state debts of all countries, and indeed such that generally only the populations of the countries come to harm. Already, in the USA and in the EU dictatorship, there exist secret plans to start a war from Germany against Russia, which shall be named as the reason for the entire arising worldwide crisis. And that thereby the blame for this war is to then be shoved onto Russia, naturally completely unrightly, if it actually comes about, is clear right from the start. And if this war actually occurs, then from that martial law is deduced which suppresses the incensed population, which will be completely dispossessed through strong and ruthless military and police powers.
32. Already today, countries exist which in truth only correspond to nominal states, and which are effectively no longer independent states.
Rather only exist in name as such, and no longer have any kind of their own state authority.
Basically, that solely concerns open areas which teem with criminal bands, and which are controlled by guerrilla fighters and warlords.
Also, Europe corresponds to an area which is besmirched by criminality and felony, but which is additionally controlled by the EU dictatorship, which is a highly dangerous dictatorship which contributes very much to the instability of the international politics, and also is a starting point and, at the same time, a will-less tool in the hands of the international terrorism, and is the point from which threats of military default will go out in the future. But from the EU dictatorship also criminal and felonious machinations through criminals and felons start out, and will come out in greater measure in the future, such as trade in drugs,
human beings and weapons, whereby, as time goes on, less and less correct conditions can be brought about.
33. There will be efforts made to dispossess Greece's population,
as will also be attempted with other countries when the opportunity arises.
34. The pension offices will no longer be able to dispense pension payments because their financial means come to an end. And indeed, on one hand, as a consequence of the higher age of the pensioners, on the other hand, because their number increases due to the increasing mass of the overpopulation. And, altogether, also, the costs of living climb, and thereby also the pension requirements, the raising of which, and even the payment of which, will however be more and more in question.
35. Many countries will get into pecuniary trouble due to nonsensical financial expenditure and financially overcommitting, where through the entire state structure and banks as well as the economy will collapse as a consequence of inevitable bankruptcy.
36. Worldwide, all social systems will collapse, as a result of which more and more human beings fall into the deepest poverty, can no longer enjoy health care, and will also die of hunger and misery, because they can no longer finance their living costs and therefore also their own food and health.
37. In the future, independent and sovereign countries will be appraised as the greatest threats and enemies for U.S. America,
whereby, as it has been for as long as can be remembered, Russia, from the confused U.S. viewpoint, will be increasingly proclaimed the greatest danger for the American security.
38. Increasingly, immense quantities of the most modern heavy weapons will be brought to Europe by the USA and be stationed in Germany and in the countries bordering Russia. But Russia does not simply accept this and arms itself with its own atomic arsenal, and also all other weapons, as well as the Russian army, that is, the entirety of the Russian military.
39. Already, today, there are not only two world mights, the USA and Russia, because there are also diverse regional great knights, which are partly armed with nuclear weapons and which have international affectations, whereby the EU dictatorship stands ahead of all of them, then also Brazil, India, Japan, Nigeria, and South Africa. However, with that, the insecurity grows for all countries and the entire world, because all arm themselves more and more, and indeed not simply to protect themselves from attacks, rather also in order to possibly attack neighboring states.
40 worldwide. The populations of many countries will become ever more unsatisfied due to the arising state miseries, and will oppose and protest to the point of having insurgencies, from which the danger of civil wars will arise. So,
41. The lives of the governors and financial leaders, who rule in a lax and wrong as well as elite, might, greedy, selfish and imperious form over the populations, will no longer be secure, and they will be forced to defend their lives as well as their goods and possessions, which will only be possible, if it is at all, when they have themselves protected by bodyguards or even their own mercenary force.
42. Worldwide, the elites of the governors and of the moneyed aristocracy, together with corrupt politicians, will set up totalitarian and dictatorial surveillance states, and thereby preserve their dominance.
43. The world of finance will increasingly promote capitalism, whereby it will all get very badly out of control in nationalistic form, that is to say, fascistically, in order to prevent and choke off other systems which may appear and arise against capitalism.
Your visions and probability calculations connect with calculations of the same kind which I already made 3 decades ago, and which can actually come to fruition. If nothing changes to the good and right in the entire terrestrial world politics, government forms, the entire economy and overall behavior of the Earth human being peoples, as well as in their intellect and rationality. and belonging to that which must be done toward the good and right are also effective, drastic and lasting regulations, which are to be made and carried out very quickly for a worldwide stop to births, and a decisive birth control in order to bring the humanity again to a mass which can be coped with by the planet and nature, which for Earth amounts to 529 million. Whereby, however, for the decimation of the Earth humanity, a number between 1 and 1.5 billion will be calculated, as my own probability calculations from 3 decades ago showed. My probability calculations 3 decades ago naturally showed a lesser percentage of possibility, namely only that of around 47.7%, which however has massively climbed since then. I have not carried out foresights concerning the calculations in this regard. But also my probability calculations reveal, as yours do, that they actually show a certain greater possibility of occurring as predictions. However, this will broaden if everything does not significantly change in the entire political, economic, and general world happenings, as well as in the general overall behavior of the Earth human beings in regard to their intellect and rationality, and if no progressive and logical modes of behavior and actions come about which can guarantee a healthy continued existence of the Earth humanity.